The tension in the television studio was suffocating as conservative commentator Mark Levin leaned forward, his eyes blazing with the kind of contempt that had made him millions of devoted followers. "Congresswoman," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "People like you don't understand the Constitution." But what happened in the next 10 minutes would leave this bombastic radio host speechless, humiliated, and forced to disappear from the airwaves for days. The folder that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett quietly placed on the table contained evidence that would not only destroy Levin's credibility, but expose the shocking hypocrisy that millions of Americans had never seen before. If you think you know how political confrontations end, you're about to witness something that changed the game forever. Hit that subscribe button, because what Jasmine Crockett did to Mark Levin will restore your faith that truth can still triumph over propaganda. The cameras had been rolling for less than 5 minutes, but already the atmosphere felt electric with hostility. This wasn't supposed to be just another political segment where talking heads yelled past each other for ratings. Mark Levin had been targeting Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett relentlessly on his radio show for 3 solid weeks, calling her everything from constitutionally illiterate to an embarrassment to Congress. Tonight, they were finally face-to-face in the same studio, and Levin clearly expected to demolish her on live television. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to this confrontation unprepared. The former civil rights attorney had spent those 3 weeks doing what she did best, building an airtight case. The leather folder beside her contained documents that would shatter everything Levin thought he knew about the woman he'd been attacking. "Welcome back to Political Crossfire," the host began nervously, clearly sensing the tension between his guests. "Tonight we have conservative commentator Mark Levin and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett discussing the controversial House Bill 1742 on voting rights. Things have been heated between these two on social media." Before the host could even finish his introduction, Levin pounced with the ferocity that had made him a household name among conservative audiences. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice already rising to that familiar pitch of righteous indignation, "people like you don't understand the Constitution. You're pushing legislation that would destroy election integrity, and frankly, your legal analysis has been amateur at best." The camera captured Crockett's reaction perfectly, calm, composed, with just the slightest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She reached for her folder with deliberate precision. "You've been taking shots at me for weeks, Mr. Levin," she replied, her voice steady as steel. "Tonight, I brought receipts." Those 2 words, "brought receipts," would become the rallying cry that echoed across social media for weeks to come. But in that moment, even Crockett couldn't have predicted just how devastating those receipts would prove to be. Mark Levin was no ordinary radio host. With over 4 decades in conservative media and millions of listeners hanging on his every word, he had built an empire by dismantling his opponents with a combination of constitutional knowledge and pure verbal aggression. His books on constitutional law sat on bestseller lists. Law schools actually used his writings in their curricula. When Levin spoke, conservative America listened, which made what was about to happen all the more shocking. "Let me tell you something about Congresswoman Crockett," Levin continued, his voice hitting that familiar crescendo that sent his radio audience into frenzies of agreement. "She represents everything wrong with today's political climate. All flash, no substance. These progressive Democrats think they can rewrite the Constitution with their feelings, but the law doesn't care about your emotions, Congresswoman." The production team had expected fireworks, but they hadn't expected the methodical demolition that was about to unfold. Crockett opened her folder with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. "You know Mark," she said, using his first name with a familiarity that clearly irritated him. "I've been listening to you misrepresent my positions and my background for quite some time now. Before we discuss House Bill 1742, I think your viewers deserve some context about why you've been so fixated on discrediting me personally instead of addressing the substance of this legislation." The first document emerged from her folder, highlighted transcripts from Levin's own radio show. The camera zoomed in just enough for viewers to see the yellow highlighting, though not the specific content. "Not yet. You've made some pretty bold claims about me and my understanding of constitutional law, haven't you, Mark?" Crockett's tone remained conversational, almost friendly, which seemed to unnerve Levin more than if she had matched his aggression. Levin smirked, clearly not expecting anything that could damage his carefully constructed persona. I only speak the truth, Congresswoman. Your record speaks for itself. Indeed it does, Crockett agreed, that slight smile never wavering, and so does yours. Something in her tone made the director quietly signal the camera operators to capture every reaction. The production assistant could be seen in the background, phone in hand, already monitoring the social media explosion that was beginning to build. Before I was elected to Congress, Crockett continued, laying out the transcripts in a neat row, I spent 15 years defending the constitutional rights of everyday Americans in federal courtrooms across this country. How many constitutional cases have you personally argued before a federal judge, Mr. Levin? The first crack in Levin's armor appeared as a flicker of uncertainty across his face. This wasn't following his usual script. When he attacked politicians, they typically responded with talking points or personal attacks. They didn't come with documents. But Levin was nothing if not resilient. He had spent decades in the media trenches, and he wasn't about to be derailed by what he assumed were cheap theatrics. Your legal analysis is amateur at best, Congresswoman, he shot back, his voice growing more aggressive. I've written books on constitutional law that law schools use as textbooks. My understanding of the Constitution has been praised by some of the finest legal minds in America. Crockett's response came with devastating calm. Mr. Levin, you've spent 3 weeks claiming I don't understand the 14th Amendment implications of this bill. But I have here the transcripts from your own show where you've misquoted that amendment repeatedly. She produced the first set of highlighted documents, and suddenly the split screen showed Levin's increasingly red face next to Crockett's steady gaze. These aren't isolated errors, Mark. They're consistent misrepresentations of established constitutional precedent. Those are clearly taken out of context, Levin sputtered, his composure beginning to crack. You're playing games with serious constitutional principles. But Crockett was just getting started. I'm happy to provide the full context, she continued, producing another set of documents. In fact, I have the complete broadcasts archived here with timestamps, and I've included analyses from 3 constitutional law professors who've noted the same errors in your commentary. The host tried to intervene, sensing that his show was rapidly spinning beyond his control.
Perhaps we should move on to—
Who? Levin interrupted, his voice rising to that familiar pitch that usually intimidated his opponents. Some left-wing academics pushing an agenda? Crockett's smile widened just slightly. Actually, she said, sliding another paper forward, one of them is Professor James Williamson from Georgetown, who you've had on your own show multiple times as a constitutional expert. He's hardly left-wing, as you put it. You've called him one of the finest constitutional minds of our generation. The camera caught the exact moment Levin realized he was walking into a trap, but by then it was far too late to retreat. Let's talk about your record in Congress then, Levin said, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative. What exactly have you accomplished besides grandstanding and race-baiting? The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Even the host visibly winced at the inflammatory language. Crockett's eyebrow raised slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. Race-baiting? She repeated slowly. That's an interesting choice of words, Mr. Levin. From her folder came another document, this one thicker than the others. You've called me unqualified 17 times on your show in the past month alone. You've questioned my intelligence 12 times. Yet you've never once mentioned my law degree from the University of Houston, my 15-year career as a civil rights attorney, or the major constitutional cases I've won. The production team could sense they were witnessing something unprecedented. The director whispered urgently into his headset, instructing his crew to capture every moment of what was clearly becoming a historic confrontation. And when you've called other members of Congress unqualified, Crockett continued, her voice taking on an edge for the first time, you've at least mentioned their policies or voting records. With me, it's always been personal. I wonder why that is. Levin's face contorted with anger. Are you implying I'm racist? That's the typical playbook, isn't it? When you're losing an argument, cry racism. I haven't implied anything, Crockett replied evenly. I'm simply presenting facts. You've treated me differently than my colleagues, and the transcripts prove it. Now, would you like to discuss House Bill 174-2? Or shall we continue examining your disparate treatment of lawmakers based on their demographics? The host, sensing a potential explosion that could get his show canceled, tried again to redirect. Let's focus on the bill itself. Congressman Crockett, can you explain why? But Levin wasn't ready to move on. His entire brand was built on being the smartest person in the room, the constitutional expert who could demolish any liberal argument. He couldn't let this first-term Congresswoman make him look foolish in front of millions of viewers. "This is ridiculous," he declared, waving his hand dismissively. "You come in here with some cherry-picked quotes trying to smear me instead of defending your terrible legislation that would destroy election integrity in America." Crockett's response was delivered with surgical precision. "Actually, I'd be happy to discuss the bill. That's why I'm here. But you've spent weeks attacking me personally rather than addressing the substance of the legislation. I thought it was important to clear the air first." She turned to face the camera directly, a move that seasoned television veterans recognized as a masterful piece of communication. House Bill 1742 is about protecting the right to vote, plain and simple. Despite what Mr. Levin has told his viewers, it doesn't change who can vote. It simply ensures that eligible voters aren't wrongfully purged from voting rolls without proper notification. Levin tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued with the authority of someone who had actually read and understood the legislation she was defending. "And if we're going to have that discussion, I think viewers deserve to know that Mr. Levin has consistently misrepresented both the bill's contents and my legal expertise." The host noticed the producer frantically signaling from off-camera. The segment was getting massive engagement online, with hashtags already trending on Twitter. "We'll need to take a quick break," he announced, though his voice betrayed his reluctance to interrupt what was clearly television gold.
"But we'll continue this enlightening discussion when we return."
As the cameras cut away, viewers watching the live stream could see Levin furiously shuffling through his own notes, clearly thrown off balance by Crockett's unexpected approach. The Congresswoman sat calmly, arranging her documents for what everyone in the studio sensed would be an even more devastating second round. When the cameras returned, the host addressed the viewers with barely contained excitement. "We're getting an unprecedented response to this segment on social media. It seems a lot of you are very interested in this exchange between Mark Levin and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." Levin immediately went on the offensive, his voice more strained than before. "During the break, I reviewed some of these so-called transcripts, and they're completely misleading. You're taking phrases out of context to construct a narrative that simply doesn't exist." Crockett's smile returned, and those watching began to sense that she had been waiting for exactly this response. "That's why I brought the full videos, not just transcripts," she said, producing a flash drive that caught the studio lights. "Would you like me to play the unedited clips? I'm sure the producers can accommodate that." The control room erupted in barely controlled chaos. This wasn't in the script, but the ratings were soaring beyond anything they had seen in years. The producer nodded frantically to the host, who appeared momentarily flustered by the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding. "We can certainly play a short clip if it's relevant to the discussion," the host managed, his professionalism warring with his amazement at what he was witnessing. "Very relevant," Crockett replied, handing the flash drive to a production assistant who practically sprinted off camera. Levin's face showed the first signs of genuine panic. "This is ridiculous theater," he protested. "We're supposed to be discussing policy, not playing edited clips of my show." "Unedited," Crockett corrected quietly. "And yes, we should discuss policy. I've been trying to for weeks, but you've been too busy questioning my intelligence and qualifications." The assistant returned, nodding to the director. Moments later, the studio screens displayed a clip from Levin's show from 2 weeks prior. His voice filled the studio. "Congresswoman Crockett wouldn't recognize the Constitution if it hit her in the face. She's completely unqualified, utterly clueless about the law. It's embarrassing, folks. Truly embarrassing." The clip ended, and the camera returned to Levin's now deeply uncomfortable expression. Several viewers would later comment that they had never seen the usually confident broadcaster look so trapped. "That was just 2 weeks ago," Crockett noted conversationally. "Now, here's a clip of you discussing Senator Richards' position on a nearly identical voting rights bill last year." The second clip played, and the contrast was immediate and devastating. "Senator Richards and I disagree on the approach," Levin's voice said in notably more measured tones, "but he's a serious legislator who understands the constitutional questions at play. We can have good faith disagreements without questioning his commitment to the country." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the host seemed taken aback by the stark difference in treatment. Two lawmakers, similar positions, but dramatically different levels of respect and professionalism. And this isn't an isolated example, Crockett summarized, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the studio. But the moment that would define this confrontation, the moment that would leave Mark Levin speechless and ultimately drive him from the airwaves, was still to come. 25 minutes into the broadcast, after weathering increasingly desperate attacks from Levin, who had called her delusional, incompetent, and a disgrace to Congress, Congresswoman Crockett calmly reached for the final document in her folder. "Mr. Levin," she said, her voice cutting through his latest tirade, "before I respond to that last barrage of insults, I'd like to address something you said on your show 3 days ago." Levin shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable with how the entire segment had progressed. Viewers could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead under the bright studio lights. "You claimed," and I quote, Crockett continued, reading from her notes with prosecutorial precision, "Congresswoman Crockett doesn't understand the first thing about constitutional law. She's never even handled a significant constitutional case. She's a fraud who got elected by playing identity politics, not through any legal accomplishment." The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. "That's a pretty serious claim about my professional background," Crockett said, her voice steady, but with an unmistakable edge. "So I brought something you and your viewers might find interesting." She revealed a document that the camera immediately focused on. It was a federal court filing, official and formal, with the distinctive formatting that legal professionals instantly recognized. "This is from Harrison v. State Election Board," she explained, holding the document so the cameras could capture it clearly. "A landmark voting rights case from 5 years ago that established new precedent for voter ID requirements. The Supreme Court cited this case just last year in their majority opinion on election access." Levine started to interrupt, but Crockett's momentum was unstoppable now. "What's interesting," she continued, "is that you've actually discussed this case on your show multiple times. You've called it one of the most important voting rights decisions of the decade. You've praised the legal arguments that shaped the outcome, saying they represented constitutional advocacy at its finest." She slid the document forward so the cameras could capture it in perfect detail. "If you look at the lead attorney on this case, the one who developed the constitutional argument that you've praised repeatedly, you'll see a name you might recognize." The camera zoomed in on the document, highlighting the attorney of record, Jasmine Crockett, Essex. The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Somewhere in the control room, a technician later said, "You could have heard a pin drop." "That's right," Crockett continued, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had just delivered a knockout blow. "I was the lead constitutional attorney on a case you've held up as exemplary legal work. I developed the 14th Amendment argument that formed the basis of the court's decision. The same amendment you claim I don't understand." The studio had become a tomb. Even the host's mouth had fallen open slightly in shock. But Crockett wasn't finished. "And this wasn't an isolated case," she said, arranging several more documents on the table. "I've brought records of 7 major constitutional cases I litigated before entering Congress. 3 went to federal appeals courts. 1 was cited in a Supreme Court decision." Each word fell like a hammer blow. "So when you tell your millions of viewers that I'm legally unqualified and have never handled a significant constitutional case, you're not just insulting me, you're deliberately misleading them about someone whose legal work you've actually praised on your own show." Mark Levin's face had drained of all color. For perhaps the first time in his decades-long broadcasting career, the man who made his living with words appeared genuinely speechless. "I don't expect an apology," Crockett continued, her composure never wavering, "but I do think your viewers deserve the truth. I've spent my career defending constitutional rights in courtrooms across this country, often successfully challenging laws that restricted voting access unconstitutionally." The host, finally regaining his composure, turned to Levin with obvious reluctance. "Would you like to respond to this information, Mark?" Levin cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the oppressive silence. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its characteristic fire. I wasn't aware of your involvement in that specific case, but that doesn't change." "It changes everything," Crockett interjected firmly, speaking with more force than she had all evening. It exposes that your attacks on me have never been about my qualifications or understanding of the law. They've been personal, targeted, and deliberately misleading. She turned to address the camera directly again. And that matters because Mr. Levin has been using these false claims about my legal background to dismiss House Bill 1742 without actually addressing its contents. Levin tried desperately to recover. One case doesn't make you. 7 cases, Crockett corrected with devastating precision. 7 major constitutional cases, all documented right here. More than most members of Congress have litigated. More than you've ever argued in a courtroom, Mr. Levin. The camera caught Levin's expression, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and what looked remarkably like panic. His entire brand, his credibility, his authority, everything was crumbling in real time on live television. Now, Crockett concluded, would you like to discuss the actual constitutional implications of House Bill 1742, or would you prefer to continue attacking my qualifications with claims you now know are false? When Levin finally responded, his voice was barely above a whisper, a stark contrast to the bombastic volume that had defined his career. I think we should discuss the bill. I agree, Crockett nodded graciously, because that's what your viewers deserve. A substantive discussion about legislation that affects their rights, not personal attacks based on falsehoods. The aftermath was immediate and unprecedented. Within an hour of the broadcast, clips of the confrontation were spreading across every social media platform. Crockett receipts became the #1 trending topic nationwide, with millions sharing the moment when she revealed her role in the case Levin had praised. But perhaps more telling was what happened to Mark Levin himself. For the first time in his decades-long career, his radio show went into reruns for 2 consecutive days. His social media accounts, usually filled with multiple daily posts, fell completely silent. When he finally returned to the airwaves, listeners noticed something unprecedented. His voice was subdued, his usual confidence replaced with an almost defensive uncertainty. Sometimes, he said, in what many recognized as the closest thing to an apology his ego would allow, we all have blind spots in our understanding. It's important to recognize expertise where it exists, regardless of political affiliation. The admission sent shockwaves through conservative media. Mark Levin, the constitutional warrior, the scourge of liberals everywhere, had been humbled by a first-term Congresswoman with a folder full of receipts. For Jasmine Crockett, the victory was complete, but not without its challenges. Overnight, she had become a national figure, with interview requests flooding her office from every major network. More importantly, House Bill 1742 was finally receiving the serious constitutional analysis it deserved, with 3 previously opposed conservative lawmakers announcing they were reconsidering their positions. As one political analyst observed, we witnessed something rare in American politics, the moment when facts triumphed over rhetoric, when expertise mattered more than volume, and when bringing receipts proved more powerful than bringing attacks. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Mark Levin became more than just a viral moment. It became a symbol of how political discourse could be elevated when substance met spectacle, when preparation met prejudice, and when the truth was given the respect it deserved. 6 months later, when modified versions of House Bill 1742's key provisions gained bipartisan support, political scientists began referring to the Crockett effect, the newfound emphasis on substantive debate backed by verifiable facts rather than personal attacks and unfounded claims. Mark Levin never fully recovered his previous level of influence. While he continued broadcasting, his audience had seen him exposed and humiliated, and that image could never be completely erased. Sometimes, in politics as in life, bringing receipts isn't just about winning an argument, it's about revealing the truth that changes everything. The folder that Jasmine Crockett brought to that studio contained more than just documents. It contained the power to prove that in an era of spin and spectacle, facts still matter, expertise still counts, and sometimes the most powerful response to repeated attacks is simply producing the evidence that makes your case for you. If this analysis of political confrontation and the power of preparation resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content that breaks down the most significant moments in our political discourse. Who else would you like to see us analyze? Comment below with your suggestions for future deep dives into the moments when truth triumphed over spin.